10 years of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture with Dan Pinchbeck. This is Staying In. Hello listener, Kris here. This is kind of a bonus episode outside of our usual schedule of things. 2025 marks 10 years since the video game Everybody's Gone to the Rapture was released. Developed by the Chinese Room, founded by Jessica Curry and Dan Pinchbeck, this game concerns the aftermath of a global catastrophe in which the player wanders through the abandoned but idyllic English village of Yorton in 1984. What the player is trying to do is piece together what happened here, why is this village empty? And as we walk, we encounter echoes of its recent past and find ourselves really just invested in the inhabitants themselves as they're coming to terms in their own way with the fate of their village and the world as a whole. And you as the player are tasked with bearing witness to some of their final moments. Cards on the table, this is my favourite game of all time. And thank you to my buddy Sam for introducing it to me all those years ago. Gosh, I play it once or twice a year. I mean, the environmental design is sublime. Dan Pinchbeck's writing is so well attuned to the micro and macro. You know, you've got the cosmological event of this world ending, this alien interaction, but also you've got the human story at the core of it, the everyday dialogue. The vocal performances are so engaging that you see beyond the specks of light in which they only exist as within the game, and you really feel the humanity there beneath. And finally, Jessica Curry's music is so achingly beautiful. It's poignant, it's hopeful. I actually had some of it played on my wedding day. It emotionally takes me to so many places, that score, and I just find it such a beautifully arresting game as a whole. So I'm really biased here in what follows, and what follows is a brief chat between myself and Dan Pinchbeck about this game. And obviously it kind of goes without saying that if you've not played Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, then I suggest you do, because this podcast is really only for those who love the game as much as I do and really want to try and mark its 10-year anniversary. So I recommend, listener, if you've not played Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, do so, then come back here and press play. And I hope you enjoy it. How do you reflect on this game after 10 years?
It's funny because we've been like Jess and I have been sort of tracking the 10 years is sort of coming, and particularly because we left Chinese Room a little while ago. So I don't know if there's any sort of like plans or anything's going to be done around the 10-year anniversary. So it was really nice to sort of talk to you about this, so kind of getting an opportunity to actually kind of go back and revisit the game a little bit. You tend to move on quite quickly, and sort of I think with any creative practice you do it and then you move on, and people are really want to sort of interested in talking about your game, but I'm just going forwards and going forwards. And I think particularly after Rapture, it was quite a strange sort of like period for us in the company in terms of where we were going next. And I'd kind of felt at the time, and I think still do, that Rapture kind of pushed walking sims as far in one particular direction it could. And I think the two things that the thing that sort of happened to the sort of the genre afterwards is you had stuff like Edith Finch, which
Yeah.
reintroduced an increasing amount of gameplay mechanics back into it, until the point when really it almost felt like the genre was not so much sort of redundant, but it's I think the genre, rather than it being sort of like hard boundaries and structures, it's often that sort of it's a bit like you know how Stanislaw Lem talks about the living ocean in Solaris, that it extrudes
Oh,
these forms for a while and then they kind of subside back into it again. And
yeah,
walking
yeah.
simulators felt like they were a zeitgeist like extrusion of a particular type of game that then sort of ended up just blending back into a wider sort of sense of how story and landscapes could work in particularly first person games after that. So I think for me, Rapture was it's still the only open world walking simulator, which I think is interesting in
Yeah,
itself. And so it does stuff with story that no other walking simulators do in terms of discovery and non-linearity. So that's really interesting for me. And it's been kind of interesting to sort of like, to be thinking about it and going back over it again a bit this year of I think Esther still sort of gathers so much attention because it was the first.
yes.
But there's some sort of levels of, I suppose, kind of like sophistication and stuff that happened in Rapture that I'm still really, really proud of. And I think we were doing things there that I don't think anyone's really done since. So
No,
that's kind of cool.
no, it's incredible. And I suppose really like over the years then, have there been any reactions from fans or players that have particularly stayed with you?
So a lot of our games seem to have had a very, very sort of like deep relationship with the people that have loved them. I think Jess's music had a lot to do with that in terms of the
Yes.
sort of like emotional power of it. But people connect really, really strongly, particularly with Esther and Rapture. And I think because Rapture was so, I think probably more so than Esther or anything else, it was a very sort of like human game. It was very sort of interested in the simple, small things of being alive and giving them a sort of a value and a recognition. That I think that did have quite a close connection because it talked about grief in a very quiet way. It talked about sort of love in a very quiet way, and it actually dealt with things like sort of the very, very small little acts of, say, like betrayal that we all do every day, and made those very recognizable. And I think the characters were complicated in a way that is really common for TV or radio or
Yeah.
film, but it's still very uncommon for games. It's still very character is still very spreadsheet driven in terms of the sort of terminology that's used. Characters are kind of created by committees, and what's their razor and what's their arc, and how do we plug them into these things? And I don't think Rapture, we kind of didn't bother with any of that sort of stuff. We just went. I think Detectorists, the comedy show, like really, really think is wonderful. It's one of the best bits of British comedy in the last couple of generations, and they really, I think, more than any other comedy show, just absolutely get it of going. If we create believable, rounded characters that you love, then it doesn't really matter what happens. You're there because you want to be in that space with those people, and that was kind of the core, I suppose,
Yeah.
of kind of Rapture's philosophy of story, and I think that's why it sort of still feels different.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's bittersweet as well because obviously these characters exist solely as flecks of light. There are no pictures apart from drawings by children that you'll see dotted around. And it's bittersweet because every time I play the game, I'm looking for what I can perceive in the light, and everyone has their own perception of what they see there. And the vignettes are these little short little morsels that we kind of just linger in. And each time I wander around, I stand next to a different person. And I was recently replaying it prior to today, and there's that scene where Sean and Di is trying to tell Lizzie what happened to Robert, her husband, and Lizzie kind of infers what's happening there. And as they walk away, you just hear Lizzie under her breath say, "Oh, Robert," and you won't ever hear that unless you're stood next to Lizzie, and that really confirms to you that Lizzie's aware of what's happened there. And it's just those moments that there's just something extremely powerful about that because it does always center the human in that regard, very, very much so.
But I think there's two things there. I mean, the first thing which I think is really interesting is it was absolutely was the point of going. You have to, your kind of agency as a player is fundamental to how you understand the story. And there are little throwaway things like those things as characters walk away from each other that they'll say something that the other character can't hear. Um, that you only hear if you follow that character. And that is it absolutely is that thing of going when we went into it, we were like, we want to tell a story that could only be told in a game. You couldn't
Yeah,
do this in any other medium because it's got to be about that sense of discovery of going, because I did this, I found that out, and then I feel special, or I feel there's an intimacy which comes with that of going, I should some of the scenes you should feel uncomfortable. There's a scene when, I think when Stephen and Lizzie are in bed together and you're going
yeah,
and watching a couple who've just had sex sort of talking
yeah,
afterwards. That's really intimate. That's really private. I shouldn't be listening to this. So you've got those kind of moments, or the finding out that Reese and Rachel are planning to run away together that you can completely miss unless. But then, if you do know that story, it changes that final scene when you
completely.
understand what is going on, why he hasn't come back for her, and why she's so sort of the underlying. I mean, it's Amy Fiona Edwards' performance is just like amazing. Anyway, we talk about the performers all day long.
Yeah, of course, yeah,
So those little things, or there's a scene where Wendy's so so awful in so many ways, and she's, you kind of led down this path of going, she's this dreadful old racist. And then there's one particular scene where she talks about her fear, and you go, she's racist because she's frightened.
Yeah.
She's frightened of what Kate represents. And it's kind
Right.
of, so these nuances that you allow into it of going, it doesn't make her any less of an awful person, but you
Yeah.
understand her a little bit better, but only if
Yeah.
you followed these routes, or you found these things, or you've really dug around. And I think that is games. That's what games can do, is going, the players that play the games most deeply, there should always be things there for them to find, and there should be the reward should be there. And a lot of games do it through sort of like power-ups and stuff like that. And we kind of just mapped that sort of gameplay design philosophy across the story in Rapture, and when it's not just about going, story explains why you're going to go here next. Actually, story kind of, like, I did a PhD on first person shooters, and
Oh no.
this is going
Yeah.
to sound really, really crass when I say it anyway. Story is kind of the additional rocket pack. So you go, if I go down that road, I get some more rockets. If I go down that road, I get some more information about this character that changes the way I think about them going forwards. And that just feels like a really cool thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the fact that it's done at the pace of a walk. I really like that. And I know there's a sprint button, which was added a little later.
So that's when we talk about sort of the regrets. That's the biggest, I think, the big regret that both Jess and I have with Rapture is the inclusion of that, which was a full on, it got play tested far too late out of our hands. And then we were told it was shipping with a sprint button, and we didn't want to do it. And we were kind of, there are some things when you work with the publisher when they fund the game and they go, you are doing this. And you go, no. And they go, you are doing this. You go, no. They go, if you want the game to ship, you are doing this. And of course it went in. And it was problematic for a bunch of reasons. It went in too late to be properly included on the instructions. It went in too late to be, because you've got a game which is timed all around that particular step. And then if you chuck a sprint function, then it just completely destroys everything. But it also, to me, the risk with it was you know that you're going to, some people will just go, it's boring. And to me, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Because games are a broad church, and you don't have to like every game. And games companies shouldn't have to say, but what about the people who want to move faster? Well, they don't matter, in the same way that they can make a choice. Provided you're communicating what the game is up front, and no one's being suckered into buying something that they didn't know what they were getting, then you've been honest about that contract. And again, it's a really interesting thing. I think because games come from they're sort of very, very commercially driven sector, they don't have the history and culture that other art forms do. They have these very, very long roots. And of course, games have incredibly long roots from an anthropological perspective. But most culture, particularly in sort of like, using the UK as an example, has hundreds of years of very class-based kind of understandings of what they are and what they're doing, what those contracts are. And games came from a place of being very commercial very quickly and then exploded, but they don't have that sort of history where you go, well, yeah, okay, but it said it was no theatre on the tin. So if it's slow, you knew what it was. I think putting something like a sprint function in blurs that to an audience of going, it says, this is what this thing is. But if you want it to be that, it sort of can be as well. And that's, I think, was a mistake. And I think partially it goes back to that idea of sort of things like people like Victor Turner and Ritual and saying Rapture is very, very self-consciously, very, very ritualistic. There's loads of hidden codes. We're talking about walking. When you play Rapture, you are walking the shape of the Lorenza tractor onto the map.
Yeah.
The entire holiday camp, when viewed from above, is a giant infinity symbol. So that was really, really important to me as well, of going, when a player walks at this speed, they are engaging in a ritual. They are summoning the world into being by doing this, and particularly a game about the world becoming light. It's almost like your playing pulls it back from extinction, and you are the sort of giving the life back into this thing. So rushing that seems so counter to what that sort of is. But you kind of know that some people just go, yeah, I've been walking now for 3 hours and all I've got is some bloke talking about the fact his truck's broken down. It's you kind of understand that at the same time.
Yeah. After each major arc, for want of a better word, we get that lovely kind of like starlit kind of trail which takes us to the next person. You generally feel like you're crossing a threshold here, and that's kind of very much cemented by the shift in weather. So we start with Jeremy at dawn and we end the game with Kate, understandably, at night at the observatory. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that kind of decision making, that structuring there, because it feels almost like an Ibsen play.
there's a line that Kate says right at the end of the game, which talks about a butterfly and says all of its life contained in a single day. And we were trying to capture that sort of sense of
Ah,
it's so fleeting, it's so vulnerable, it's so fragile, which is why it's special. And I think doing that was a big part of it, having that sort of almost like pathetic fallacy arc of the weather of going, this is, we are like there's the sort of real portent in Stevens where everything's red and sunset, but it's not a real sunset, it's a saturated, the world is ending kind of feeling. So those, I think, it was really important. But what's really interesting is that when we first started making the game, so the original prototype, the core part of the game was set under a total eclipse of the sun. So you were actually playing most of the game in that sort of real surreal darkness. And then
right.
we created a system where we could scroll backwards and forwards dynamically through the seasons. So by tilting the controller, you would start off in that, and as you tilted the controller left, you'd scroll back, and you could go backwards or forwards in time. So flat trees would blossom, create leaves, the
Wow.
leaves would fall, snow would appear on the ground, things would freeze over, then they'd thaw again, and the sun would come out. And it was really beautiful and it was lovely. And then the idea was as you found the scenes, that sort of like triggering mechanic, you'll be scrolling backwards and forwards. So it was over the course of, I think, about 6 or 7 months that the game took place, the events of the game, as opposed to, I think it was about a week in the end. So you would be going backwards and forwards in time to try and find the point in time where a significant event occurred in that location. And then
Amazing.
if you did that, that would unlock it. And it was really, really interesting. But the problem was is that we turned the whole thing then became people weren't focusing on the story. They were saying, how do I solve the problem of the game? It was just a puzzle. How do I solve the puzzle in this location? How do I
Mm,
find the right place in this location? And they weren't engaging with emotionally with it in the same way. So that all got stripped out around sort of the end of pre-production. And then we sort of like settled onto these different spaces. And we knew we wanted to have character arcs. Again, initially the idea was is that we didn't really have there weren't really particularly main characters at all. And it was just going to be a pure ensemble piece, but we sort of found that people needed to anchor onto a story in a bit more of a kind of controlled way. So we kind of slightly amped up those six characters, or five really. I don't think Kate sort of counts in that way, to give it just slightly more, I suppose, slightly more gravitational pull towards the main thread of the story, but never wanting to go so far down that road that what I was really, really interested in was that how different audience members would lock on to other characters and invest in those other characters. And that felt more interesting to me
yeah.
than understanding exactly what had happened to the world. And what was really, I think, gratifying about the game is how that really, really worked, that people really became incredibly attached to minor characters and were playing it to
Yeah.
find out what happened to them and working out what happened to them, which is wonderful.
How did you approach writing Rapture? Was it the case that you wrote your script and then you fragmented it, or were you writing fragments that eventually assembled and became a whole?
It was a bit of both. I mean, Rapture was a spreadsheet for probably the first year and a half of its existence. It was a very, very, very complicated spreadsheet, and there was sort of tech stuff going on in terms of trying to make stuff work, and there was sort of kind of an awful lot of assets being produced in terms of art. But the story, the story was completely different. The initial sort of prototype story was completely mad. I'm trying to just piece it together at the moment. So I've started like jumping some stuff on Substack at the moment, and I dug out the original Rapture story, which is all to do with manifestation and demanifestation and eschatology and all sorts of weird stuff. And that I'll stick it up there when I've sort of like tied it up a bit. But it was very, very much about characters. It was knowing who the characters were. And then they came quite early, I think. We knew who a lot of them were quite early. We knew that Jeremy would be sort of struggling with, I don't want to say struggling with his faith because it's a bit of a cliche, but struggling with how a very urban young vicar is coping with being put into a very rural environment.
Wendy Boyles, yeah.
Um, yeah. And there was always a sort of a question in there that we did never really wanted to explore about sort of like Jeremy's sexuality as well, of whether that was something like in the same way that for me, Meg is gay, and that's like a
Yeah.
really important part of it, but it's never talked about anywhere in the thing. It's just there for me as a character. So we knew these things about these people, and we knew that it was, even though we didn't know, like initially there was a lot of talk about can we have the idea of an absent apocalypse where we say an apocalypse is happening, but we literally never go into what it is. And it kind of, because it doesn't really matter what it is. So the actual sort of like what it is that's going on in the world followed from character development in quite a serious way, because we sort of went, well, actually, what's most important is how the characters and the villagers respond to this. And so whatever situation we put them in, we know how they're going to react or how they ought to react. So a lot of those kind of like there's a lot of exploration around that of just going, what would they do if? Is it appropriate for them to have children? Is it appropriate for them to have a job? What does all these, how do these things work? And then we sort of knew that there had to be a broad kind of corridor of story from start to finish. It couldn't be completely open. So there was a huge amount of time as the world was being built of going, well, Charlie can't be there on Tuesday because he's got to be there at this, and then moving people around and remapping stories across from one character to another without ever breaking the character, going,
Yeah.
it can't be any one of these people could do that, but these people can't do that, and they can't do that for this reason. So it was like a huge game of kind of three-dimensional chess, whilst sort of at the center of it was this constant thing of going, every character has to behave in a way which is true to that character, and we have to continue to create enough space so we're basically steering clear of any exposition. So we do
Yeah.
always have that idea of the players sort of like discovering stuff, that it does fundamentally feel like this is a kind of a weird post-apocalyptic sort of archaeology expedition where you're going, I am learning. It should be like going into Pompeii
Yeah.
and going, by the mosaic on the wall, I infer something about this person, and then I start telling my own stories in that space. And on top of that, you've got game development, right? Where you're suddenly going, okay, well, you can't have any more bushes because we're out of memory. So you're going to have rhododendrons there, even though you've got too many of them over there. And we don't want it all to be rhododendrons for 20 minutes. So we've got to put something in the middle. We've got to
Yeah.
create that visual interest. And we've got to have points, vantage points where you can see where you're going, and beats where you can go, something happened here. You've got to have secret places. So the story's got to respond to all those things as well, because you can't just go, right, just make this story.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of responsiveness in terms of going, well, we really want to do something with a space like that. Who would be in that space, and what would they be doing, and when would they be doing it? And then on top of that, the next layer on top of that is Jess was creating this incredible music, and that needed time and space to
Yeah.
breathe, where we knew we wanted to do stuff like characters have a theme. And
Yeah.
if you've had a particularly emotional scene with a character, we want to introduce that theme during that scene, but then have that theme run with you as you walk away. So you're thinking about that character as you keep going. And there were lots of really amazing things happening very, very subtly with the music, like in the sort of the ambient, procedurally constructed music. If you'd just been following and just had a scene with a character, almost subliminally,
Yeah.
that theme would be introduced into the ambient mix and stuff. So we were kind of just playing with the mood or tone of characters. So you've got this big sort of like dynamic, kind of like trying to nail jelly to a wall, kind of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
going on. And then you're trying to sort of keep the thread of the story within that. So it had to be quite responsive in that way. So I don't think the actual story really was seriously kind of like in any way pinned down, probably until about halfway through development, just because it couldn't be. There were too many moving
No,
parts.
and it makes perfect sense because there is such an intrinsic link between the story and the environment, and that's not the remit of one person. That is so many people having to work very closely and collaborating together. I really like how narratively there's a justification for why we stay within the confines of that village.
It was a tricky one, that one, putting that in the story, because that felt very much like, how do we relate to the outside world? And I think that was one of the ones that we had quite a lot of discussions about, was the whole, how much about the outside world do we talk about, and how much of the outside world do we let in?
Yeah.
Um, and like there's kind of I think like that sort of history of sci-fi has always been something I've always been into. So almost like a Z for Zachariah kind of
Yeah.
feel as well, of kind of going, it's just, it doesn't matter. There is only this valley.
Yeah.
Nothing else actually matters outside it. But
Yeah.
that was quite a tricky thing. And I still, that's, I suppose, one of the bits of the story that I feel it's the closest the game gets to a sort of like a Deus Ex Machina of going, we need to do this in order to justify this. And
Yeah.
it's always difficult as a writer when you be sort of forced into that position.
You were talking about the characters themselves and the fantastic performances. I had the pleasure of seeing Dear Esther live, where Oliver Dimsdale was reading the narration there live, and it was extraordinary. What, for want of a better word, what stage directions do you put into your scripts for actors, or is it something for them to discover? I think it was Kate Saxon who worked with them quite
Kate
closely.
Saxon, yeah. So it was the first time Kate and I worked together, actually. And Kate, I mean, she's brilliant. Probably one of the, I think, if not the best voice director in the business. She's so good. And we we ran the whole thing as a TV shoot. So we spent about 3 weeks on it, and every single scene. There weren't loads of stage directions in the script because I don't, just from a sort of like a background in theatre and stuff like that, I've never been a big fan of that. It was never my bag. I like the idea of going, fundamentally, you should allow actors to find the characters, and if you constrain them too far, you don't. So you've kind of got one end, you've basically got sort of Beckett at one extreme where you are not allowed a single degree of freedom within it, or you've got something which is much more improvised. And sort of like, I come from that sort of background where I was really interested in stuff like Sam Shepard, and then I say through that to things like the Performance Group, Richard Schechner, the Worcester Group, Liz
Yes.
Lecomte, stuff like that,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
where it is much more about the sense of going, if we enable discovery in this space, then we will occasionally find lightning in a bottle, which you don't find if you sit in the script everything solidly. So when Kate and I started working together, and it's how we've always worked since, we've quite often been like, if she's directing, I'm in the booth as well. We'll rewrite lines if they don't feel like they're working live, let actors explore, let improvisation happen, and then rewrite that into the script. So there's a very sort of like dynamic, holistic kind of like process. And we did all this, but we also did it. We hired a soundstage, and we basically did, I think, a week and a half of rehearsals where we just treated it as a theatre or TV production. We let the actors play with the parts. We rewrote on the fly, let them move around the space, and then they were all head mic'd and we had boom mics, so there was no sitting in a booth for it. And I hate, you can always hear it in games when actors aren't in the booth at the same time together. Like, I've got an
Yeah.
ear for it now, and I think it's terrible. And it's just sort of laziness and cheapness, really. That means the actors should always be in the same room, because then you get a really natural performance. And the other thing which a lot of audio people in games, in my experience, haven't liked, they go, but you don't get a clean sound. And I'm like, I'm not interested in a clean sound. I'm interested in a true sound. So I want to hear clothes rustling, and I want to hear if an actor makes a noise, or if you can hear their breath, or if they stumble over a word. Keep it in. It's important. It's humanity. If you make everything too clean, you end up with the sort of something you tend to find in a lot of AAA games where it's so cleaned up,
Yeah.
and then the actual noises are added back on later. And I'm like, why didn't you just capture this at the time? But it means that you don't get very natural performances a lot of the time, because people are trying to go, oh, well, I can't do that because I made this glitch or this sort of thing. So being able to do it as if it was a TV shoot, and just basically saying, we're going to put these actors in a room. They know the characters really well. They've had the script. They're off book. They've learned their lines. They're not reading it for the first time. They've had a week and a half rehearsal. We've rehearsed scenes until we feel they're right. And even then, there's capacity to change and to improvise within it. And I think that was a big part of why I think Rapture is still. It's nice when you can say things without it sounding like you're a massive ego monster. I think Rapture is one of the games where I think it has some of the best voice performances in video
Oh, yeah.
games,
A lot of
period,
people have said
ever.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that has a lot to do with Kate's direction. It has a lot to do with Kate and the other people at the side who worked on the casting, because the casting's absolutely exceptional. And it has a lot to do with, I think, a brilliant group of actors who really, really invested in the script and really embraced the capacity to be able to go, what do you want to bring to this part? What do you want to bring to this story? And we'll work with that as we go through. And I think Kate said to me a little while ago that she's never ever done a video game shoot like it since, and she's constantly trying to tell people to do shoots like that, because there's no reason why you can't, and the results really speak for themselves. But we've always, like, when we then, both with Kate when I've worked with her, and also the other director I've worked with, Mark, who did Little Orpheus, we've always worked in that way. I'm always like, no, actors in a room, let them improvise, let them play off each other. And it does, yeah. I've left a trail of slightly unhappy audio designers behind me going, but it's so messy. And I'm like, yeah, it's good. We need mess. Games are too clinical. It's one of the problems with them in terms of their sense of reality.
Is there a moment you can think of where a discovery was made by an actor in the space that changed something quite dramatically for you as a writer?
I think rather than a single moment, I think there are points. I really remember the actor who played.
Simon Chandler?
He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. He's like about half the cast is from The Archers. And he came up to me, and it was just before the death scene in the car where he's recording in his dictaphone. And he said, feel like you've written this character as a bit of a buffoon. And he said he is a bit of a buffoon, but he said, I think there's a depth to be found here. Will you let me just try and find a bit more depth to him? And I was like, yeah, go for it. And he made, I think, a couple of tiny script tweaks. And then he recorded that scene, and Kate and I just looked at it and I went, oh, and I went back and rewrote the Doctor's part after that recording and went, no, he's right. This character's too shallow at the moment. He needs more depth. And we gave him a lot more humanity and a lot more depth after that. I think those moments, being able to do that as a writer, but I think being able to do that, you should be able to do that as a writer. And even if you're writing, let's say now I'm writing novels, you still have to listen to your characters, and your characters will tell you if they're honest and real, and you have to be able to put your own sense aside for what the characters are telling you. Actors make that very easy. I think Ollie found a warmth in Stephen that wasn't there initially in the script. I think his performance makes Stephen a much more sympathetic character than he initially was. I think Lou playing Lizzie, I think was just lifted Lizzie off the page with a dignity that was incredible. We didn't change a lot of the script, but she just, it felt like she just knew that character. She just fell into it. I mean, she's a brilliant actor anyway. And I think the time that I really, really remember, I think more than anything, one of my strongest memories of the whole of development was when David, the guy who played Frank, we'd just captured him, and I think it was for a test, and we dropped the voice in to the last scene where he's triggering off the air raid siren on top of the hill. And we got the whole team together and we sat, and most of the team hadn't really heard many of the voices at all. And we just put it into place and played that scene and looked around the room like everybody on the development team was in tears. And we were like, something's happening here, actually, with this is going to work, what we're doing. And that was very sort of like, I think when you have those moments when you know that the performances that are coming in are that good, it just creates you quite liberated in terms of going, we can push this because we can do this, we can deliver on this story can work, and we can let these actors go even further, and we can really, I think, go into some places that were very not gamey, but also very difficult, kind of scenes that were like, really, can we sort of respect the characters and the stories enough to do this, to do things like the scene where Jeremy finds again, I've forgotten the character's name, not Barbara, crying when she says at the end of it, which is probably I think one of the saddest lines of the game, one of my favorite, where she says, "Oh, the kids have been upstairs, and my husband went upstairs to look for them. That
Oh,
was 4 hours ago. I'm too scared to go upstairs and look because she knows they're dead."
yeah.
And it was the performance that kind of you get the performance and you go, "We know you're good enough to be able to handle these kind of lines, and they're not to be sort of schmaltzy or kind of like feel like they're crass."
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And
you get good actors your way.
and every time I encounter that scene, following them up the stairs to the bedroom is extraordinary. I really like the fact that, as you say, the vocal performance is so much heart and soul behind these specks of light.
So I grew up in a village in the 1980s, and it was, and so so did Jess. And so when we were sort of creatively working on it together, then I think we both sort of had that sort of again that same experience of going, you've got all this extraordinary stuff going on, but we're also talking about the early 80s where we've got the AIDS pandemic happening, and like the notion of sort of like, we were being told, being pumped full of the TV, being told, don't fall in love, don't have sex, it'll kill you. And particularly sort of like the sort of like very violent homophobic sentiments that went sort of alongside that of going, there are strangers amongst you that are dangerous that will infect you and kill you with the disease. Like, and it's kind of there's an interesting sort of correlation, obviously, to the way in which sort of, clinically vulnerable people were demonized during the recent pandemic and still are. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But you also had sort of like, we were made to watch Threads at school when we were like 12. So they're like, this is what a nuclear war will be like, and this could happen. So you have this sort of bucolicism and everything else, and everyone's going, green and pleasant land, green and pleasant land. Oh, but that'll kill you, that'll kill you, that'll kill you, that'll kill you. These people are evil. These people want to kill you. These people will infect you. And so there is that really strong sort of juxtaposition in there. I think that couldn't help but sort of find its way in. But it's also, I think, part of the kind of like the core of the game. And again, when Jess and I were talking about it very, very early on of what we wanted it to be, was the game was going, well, we're kind of using, like I think the best cozy catastrophe does, we're using the apocalypse as a lever to basically say what is worth it about life, and I think that sort of bucolicism in the landscape really sort of like helps with that of going, but this is a beautiful place. This can be a beautiful world. There's no reason why this can't be a beautiful world apart from the actions that we undertake, which make it less beautiful. So that's kind of at the heart of the story, I think, as well.
I mean, there are horrific aspects of this, but I've never ever seen it as a horror game, if that makes sense. Again, it goes back to this idea that genres aren't these six things. It's about these kind of this blurring there, and I really like the fact that it's not trying to simplify or trivialize. If you want to call it death here, I don't know if even death's the right word to call what happens to these characters. And I really kind of quite like the fact that it doesn't force us to make an opinion as to what happens to them. We have the character of Jeremy there who's trying to obviously look at this through the prism of their respective faith. Stephen and Kate very much looking at it in a very materialist kind of sense, really.
Like with Jess's music, I think she creates, and you know, something that's been said about her music before, a she's probably the composer who gets closest to me to a kind of a secular sacred in her work than anybody else, where she's a fierce kind of like humanist, but it's you can feel the transcendentalness in that music of kind of going through the universality of the human experience. Um, I remember, like, I'm a big fan of, I love Carl Sagan, and there's a sort of a wonderful bit in, I think it's in the Demon Haunted World, which is like an extraordinary book about sort of like faith and secularism and kind of like science and its place and rationality and irrationality in the world. And he said the biggest problem he's always had with a lot of sort of like faith when he's engaged with it is when you compare it to the wonder and the splendor of cosmology and the scale and the scope. He said it was very parochial in response of going, yes, but we want to be this. But okay, and he says, oh, that's all right, but then shouldn't this be as big as that? Because that's there and it's huge. So I feel like in there was that sort of sense in Rapture of going, we want it to feel so you know, obviously the title sort of like leans in that direction, but we wanted to feel like it had this kind of, you know, very sort of pseudo sort of like religious edge, that it is a game about the sacredness of human life, about the sacredness of human connection, the sacredness of love. And so it should have that sense of, it should feel like you're in a church, or you know, it's because it is important, but at the same time it shouldn't be, we want to avoid it being hectoring or didactic or too
Yeah.
po-faced around it, but more sort of says, if you there is a transcendental in the everyday, it exists. And when you see it, you can see the wonder. We're surrounded by the wonder in such like small, tiny events, but usually it's crisis that brings us to a point where we see it.
Yeah.
So in terms of the sort of the end of the world of going, I mean, there was a sort of the running joke at the beginning of it, we're going, if I think I've been playing a lot of Fallout at the time of going, none of us would be in Fallout. We'd be the ash piles. We
Yeah.
all would, you know, we'd all be dead. We're not going to survive the apocalypse. So the things which are going to be important, like running around in power armor, is great. It's brilliant. It's a power fantasy, you know. It's thing, but kind of like the other stories which are in there are really kind of interesting. Of like going, actually, what would really matter is the world's about to burn. But what I really care about is the fact that it means they've cancelled the buses and I can't get to the school to pick the kids up, and that's the preoccupation which is real, like for most people. So that I think, you know, Rapture sort of did that. We're not the only game that's done that. I mean, System Shock 2, the sort of Suarez Siddons storyline that runs through that of just two people that are in love, just trying to both get from one end of the ship to the other
Yeah.
to meet each other to escape. And it's one of the most powerful stories in System Shock 2. Horizon Zero Dawn, the
Yeah.
best writing and story in Horizon Zero Dawn is the stuff where it's just people realizing that the wonderful bit where you go in to the actual Zero Dawn project where it's following three characters when they're told that actually it doesn't work. They're not going to save their families, and everyone is going to die, and they're going to die as well. But in 300 years, things might continue, and that some of them go, "Oh yeah, cool," and some of them completely freak out, and you know, and it's that sort of those little human things. That's what makes Zero Dawn. It gives Zero Dawn the depth that it has as a game. So yeah, I think, and it also, I suppose, it's about being tonally different as well. You know, Rapture isn't. I don't think it's not kind of just like everything is shit and everybody's going
Yeah.
to die. There's a lot of brevity in it. There's a lot of light, which I think was really important as well. And so again, having some actors who are, you know, intrinsically really very funny helped there as well.
And I think like that lightness is literal and metaphorical, because even though it is difficult to lose these characters, it is a beautiful, beautiful loss to see this dissipation. And again, as you're talking about this kind of entropic kind of movement from our corporeal form dissipating into these kinds of specks of light, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. And the fact that we still hear nature as we're walking around. We don't see presence of any living humans, but we still hear the bees, we hear the birds. Nature is kind of carried on. And I like, again, that ambiguity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is, it's something that we kind of, again, it's got really strong historical precedent, and it's it's kind of a source of real fascination to me. It's the whole kind of not just the kind of as extreme as the sort of Ozymandias thing. Like I went to a few years ago before the Russian invasion, went to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and being in Pripyat and sort of going, you're walking through a forest and then you realize you're in a stadium of
Yeah.
going, it's temporary, it will go again. Or like, the sort of when Europeans were first racing around the sort of Amazonian basin. And even now we're still going, like the latest kind of like sort of archaeological things, them going, oh, these cities were like 4 or 5 times bigger than we thought they were. This was an urban metropolis underneath the parts of the Amazon. It's not just like the occasional little like Mayan ruins or stuff like that. We're talking about an urban civilization. And I think that's really, really important, the idea of going, it is all temporary. It is all temporary. And that's in a way, I suppose, really sort of one of the main core messages of Rapture is going, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We are all going to die, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Everything everybody all of that is going to end, and that's okay. And
Yeah.
actually, it needs to, because that's what gives it a sort of a humanity. And I think the sort of flip side of that, which is, being explored by writers, because it's such a grim reality of kind of like the sort of like tech bro billionaires at the moment, of going, I want to live forever. And you're going, you've completely missed the point of life if you think that living forever is,
Yeah.
is what you're really aiming for. But that's why there's something so seriously wrong with you and your worldview, because it's not about sort of saying the hundreds of micro moments that occur every day are the things that make it valuable. And that's, I think we really wanted to capture that in Rapture. And if we did, then we succeeded.
I suppose really like, and this is just because I have a particular emotional investment in environments within games. Is there a particular place within the village of Yorton that you feel encapsulates the spirit of Rapture?
I'm not sure there is. I think we spent we spent such a long time. It was such a balancing act between the amount of assets we could actually stuff into the game at the size it wasn't in terms of it running. That I feel like the art team did a really, really wonderful job of saying, you've only got X amount, you've got 7 things you can put in a house to sell a character, but these houses can't look generic. So I think it was really, they did so well in terms of kind of making it. Howard's train set,
Yeah.
really loved. So Howard's train set's the only interactive object in the game. There were supposed to be loads more, but we ran out of time and money and putting everything else. Originally, we kind of wanted to put sort of something interactive into each main character's house. But people played with that train set for ages.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's a trophy attached to it as well, I think, if memory serves me correct.
The trophies is a whole other thing.
I know I didn't want to talk about that, but yeah.
Well, we
But
had to do it. We were told we absolutely
I
had to do
know.
them. And I was like, I'm not doing them well, we had a massive fight. We had such a big fight with Sony about it. Because I was like, I'm not putting a single trophy in that can be triggered accidentally. Because if you're not playing for the trophies, they should not get in your way at all. So the only trophies I want in the game are ones that you have to specifically do specific things that normal players wouldn't do. So like the moonwalking one of like walking backwards for like however long it was. And then there was this big thing of going, well, no, because trophies are a really critical part of the PlayStation experience. And I'm like, well, not for me and not for a whole bunch of players they are. So the trophies have to be there for people who want trophies. But the idea of you're going to say, we're going to make a game which is incredibly immersive, ritualistic, and everything else, and then it's going to go ping in the corner what feels like a random point. Feels so, yeah. There was a big fight about that, but yeah, they kind of, it was nice. It also kind of, the trophies that we did have in there was a little kind of like nod to actually the kind of like player base of going, we're not all these terribly like completely po-faced kind of like moustache twirling hipsters. We actually are humans and we do
Yeah.
have a sense of humor. It was just not appropriate to put it in this place. The one thing which got cut out of the game, which we had a very, very, very long conversation about, was we actually built it and it was in the game for a little while, was we made a bathtub on wheels, like the one from Last of the Summer Wine, where
Yeah.
the three old
Combo.
guys go down a hill in a bathtub. Yeah, we built that, and we had it at the bottom of a hill, hidden in a bush, and then we were like, it's just too much of an Easter egg. It'll just break the mood if you find it accidentally. But yeah, I don't know. I think there are some places, some vistas that I love. I love the top of Frank's Hill. I think
Yeah.
is amazing. I think it's just so beautifully done. And I think the vignettes in the last part of the game when you're in the observatory with Kate, there's some stuff there which is so odd, but it kind of is, it's odd, but in a way it doesn't, I hope, feel just oh, there's no real depth to this. Like there is a sort of like the TVs that are hung up of
Yeah.
going, there is a logic to why she's done that. That's
Yeah.
really important. It's not just that it looks cool, kind of
Yeah.
contemporary Netflix director. I have no idea why it's there. It just looks cool kind of thing.
I have a picture of the morning tree on my wall at home. I call it the morning tree. I don't know if it is the morning tree. In my head canon, again, that is the morning tree because there's the sheet music on, I think, in the piano in Wendy's house or one of the houses. It says the morning tree there, and I know that is a track that's in the score. And in my head, that has kind of becomes this kind of beautiful kind of overlap between scripts, environmental design, and sound in particular, where I look down, there's the scene between Kate and Frank, and I love their dynamic, the two of them.
Weirdly, Kate didn't record with everybody else because she was based in the States, we had to get her over. So you would never know it, but that was the one voice which was recorded separately.
It is a game that I replay quite often, and because I just can't puzzle it out and I refuse to, and particularly over what's happened over the last 10 years globally, the game has really taken on a kind of a new meaning and significance for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you. No, really appreciate it. And yeah, I think it's sort of just take a moment to sort of like pay tribute to the rest of the team as well, because there was some phenomenally talented developers who worked on that. And it really was a team effort to get it out the door. And particularly, I think the person to call out on all of that is Jess as well. I think kind of
Yeah.
not just for the score, but we concepted it together and this sort of stuff. And I think you can sort of I think there's a lot of very clever things in Rapture, but there's an awful lot of heart in it. I think a lot of that heart comes from Jess. So
Very much so. Genuinely a real labour of love. It really is. Thank you to Dan again for joining me. And thanks to you, listener, for experiencing this special bonus episode of our podcast. I should say that if this is your first time listening to Staying In, please do consider subscribing to us. We've been going for quite a while now, and we think what we do is really good. And it's worth saying, in addition to covering video games such as Everybody's Gone to the Rapture or Still Wakes the Deep, which Dan also wrote, we look at a range of things that we feel are worth staying in for, including board games, comic books, movies, novels, TV, and more. And if you visit stayinginpodcast.com, that gives you all the information you need to know about the kind of work we do. And we have 2 podcasts that come out every month, the 1st and the 15th of every month. A new episode drops. So why not subscribe and learn a little bit more about all the things that are worth staying in for. Thanks for listening and take care.